Here we go with Week 10 fantasy football, and we're trying to set our lineups. There's a lot of wide receivers out there, but who are the best choices for Week 10? It's simple. You just look for the guys who are catching the most balls. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake Fancy Headliners. Hopefully you guys are all doing well out there. Welcome to Week 10 Fantasy Football, where today, talking about the ball catchers. That's right, wide receivers starts and sits for Week 10 Fantasy Football. Now, similar to our other episodes, once again, I'm going to state this again. Do not get so caught up with the names in the starts in the sits column. Take the information that's being provided with the names and use that to make your decisions on Sundays. We don't see everybody's lineups. We don't see your opponents. We don't know your records. Without all that information, we can't legitimately tell you who to start and who to sit. We're just providing information, some perspective to help you make those decisions on Sundays. That's what it's all about over here. Not a couple guys just telling everybody what to do. That's not how this works. Nobody can see the future. We're just trying to make those decisions a little bit easier on you, the team owner. So now, before we dive into Week 10, let's look at Week 9 and see how we did at the wide receiver position. Overall, Week 9 was a really great week for the wide receiver position. We had a total of 60 players on this show last week that we gave a start or sit designation to. Out of those 60, 40 of them were correct there for the week, giving us an accuracy percentage of 67%. Not bad at all. Some of our biggest hits, DK Metcalf found the end zone again. Emmanuel Sanders looks rejuvenated with the San Francisco 49ers. Mohamed Sanu turned into a target machine for the New England Patriots. Curtis Samuel found the end zone, also solid day for the Panthers. And Jarvis Landry we talked about last week. A lot of that defensive attention going towards Odell, who benefits Jarvis Landry. We had all those guys as starts last week, so hopefully they were able to help you out. Some of our biggest misses. Preston Williams of the Miami Dolphins had himself a huge game before suffering a season-ending injury. Hate to see that. Jamison Crowder was all of a sudden involved again. He hadn't hardly been all year long outside of maybe 2 games. He had a solid game. Allen Robinson absolutely sucked. Well, Allen Robinson didn't suck, but Mitch Trubisky continued to suck. Therefore, Allen Robinson a miss for us. Robbie Anderson, expected big things for him against Miami. A whole lot of nothing. And then Odell Beckham, I had him as a sit last week, ended up with 10.5 fantasy points, just barely over the cutoff there for our hits and misses. So technically, he was a miss despite having a pretty poor game other than a big catch there at the end. So overall, Week 9, pretty solid, and now we're going to be heading into Week 10. A lot of bye weeks to worry about this week. So what are we going to do? What decisions are we going to make? How are we going to set our lineups for the wide receiver position? We're talking about all the matchups right now. Chargers and Raiders up first, and man, is this a great matchup for the Los Angeles Chargers. Right now, the Raiders are giving up on average 29.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but to say that Keenan Allen has been struggling is a little bit of an understatement. Dude has blown here for months. What is going on with Keenan Allen? He now has 6 straight games in single-digit scoring fantasy points. What the heck's going on? He hasn't had more than 61 yards receiving or a touchdown since Week 3. We're going into Week 10. Keenan Allen at some point is going to produce a better game. Now, Mike Williams, he's coming off his best game of the year, which is crazy to say because he only had 3 catches. But he turned them into 111 yards receiving and had himself a solid Week 9. He is the big threat play in this offense. He's not solely reliant on the volume. In the past, Keenan Allen's been more of a volume type receiver that really thrived in PPR formats. Now, at some point, this offense is going to heat up and they're going to get going. If they can establish the running game now with Anthony Lynn calling plays, if Melvin Gordon can start being productive out of the backfield, that's going to open more things up for Keenan Allen, Mike Williams on the outside. Mike Williams more of a flex play this week, but both of these guys, due to the matchup, are going to be in my lineup. Now, for Oakland, it's really still just Tyrell Williams, but Hunter Renfrow is starting to somewhat make a name for himself. He's starting to get more targets in this offense. He has 11 targets, 10 receptions, 142 yards, and 2 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. Right now, the Chargers giving up right around 19 fantasy points per game. Tyrell Williams still continues to be somewhat touchdown dependent. Last week, his first game that he's played in where he didn't score a touchdown, and he probably hurt your fantasy team because of it. He's going to remain that way. He's not seen enough volume and not racking up receptions fast enough to give you that safe floor. Both of these guys have flex play potential here just due to all the buys this week. I'm not overly excited to throw either one of them in my lineup, but if I'm struggling with bye weeks or injuries, Hunter Renfrow and Tyrell Williams have some upside here in Week 10. Ravens and Bengals up now, and maybe we thought this may be the return of A.J. Green. It sounded like it just a couple days ago, but now reports are already coming back that he doesn't feel great after the walkthrough, and there's a chance that he's just going to be day-to-day and may not play this week. But, really doesn't matter. We have now a new rookie quarterback starting for the Cincinnati Bengals in Ryan Finley, a horrible offensive line, no resemblance of a running game, and a very confident Baltimore Ravens defense right now coming off a big win against the New England Patriots. Now, they should be trailing the most of this game, so Ryan Finley should at least see a lot of passing attempts, but with A.J. Green more than likely sitting and Tyler Boyd being the main focal point of the passing game, there is just too much risk in this matchup for me to really want to throw Tyler Boyd into the game anyway. He's been super inconsistent to start the year. Started off really hot, and then things went downhill in this passing game. The offense as a whole for the Cincinnati Bengals is horrific. No resemblance of a run game. Like I said, Joe Mixon struggling to do anything from the backfield. This is just not an offense that I really want a huge part of, especially with a rookie quarterback in his first start against a confident defense. I'm avoiding both Tyler Boyd, even A.J. Green if he does play. Now I'll take a stab a little bit though on Hollywood Brown of the Baltimore Ravens this week. Cincinnati allows 23.2 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. No other wide receiving threats really there in Baltimore. Outside of Hollywood Brown, it's really just a bunch of tight ends and Mark Ingram and Lamar Jackson running the ball. That's about it. The big plays that we saw earlier in the season, they're going to start popping back up now that Hollywood Brown is back to full health, and that could happen this week. Like the matchup as a flex play, due to bye weeks and injuries, I'd start Marquise Brown. Bills and Browns up next, and before we get into this matchup that is the train wreck of the Cleveland Browns, I was kind of thinking about Baker Mayfield because he's really the source of a lot of the problems here in this offense. Not solely on him, but a lot of those problems are on Baker Mayfield's shoulders. And what happened to Baker from last year? The guy who was confident and cocky and didn't look like he was selling pharmaceutical supplies on the corner. The guy has totally let himself go. Looks more like a dude, taking his kids to soccer practice than he does an NFL quarterback. It's just odd what has happened to him, and it got me thinking. I don't know who out there has seen this movie. I'm sure there's a lot of you that have. The movie Major League, which is a baseball movie. Now, in the first movie of that, you saw Charlie Sheen come in. He came from prison. He was a hard-throwing pitcher. Didn't give a crap. He was cocky, confident, went out there and struck everybody out. Had to learn how to really become a Major League pitcher. And by the end of the movie, he was great. Well, that's kind of Baker Mayfield last year, right? Then in the offseason, as we head into Major League 2, the movie, you see Charlie Sheen as somebody who is, he's rich. He's got a lot of money. He's got a girlfriend. He's more refined. He starts naming his pitches, and he starts getting absolutely blown up. Sound familiar, Baker Mayfield again? And then all of a sudden, it kind of took a rebirth of him to go back to his roots, to regain that confidence and cockiness, to really, turn it back on again. So somebody, for the love of God, send Baker Mayfield, Major League 1 and Major League 2, to wherever he's living. Dude needs to watch it because he needs to regain what he was back in 2018. That's where all the success is going to come from. You see it from Odell Beckham. He looks frustrated. Jarvis, he's a little bit more consistent to a certain degree. He does have back-to-back games with double-digit targets, but bad offensive line play, it's not helping. Poor decision-making on Baker's part, it's not helping either. But now, this is a tough matchup going up against the Buffalo Bills, who only allow 14.3 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is second best in the NFL. Listen, it's a home game for Cleveland, and this is basically maybe one of their last chances to start to right the ship a little bit here and gain some momentum going into the second half of the season. The pressure is going to be on, and I'm going to gamble this week, and I'm going to start both Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry. Like I said, Jarvis a little bit safer at this point. It's going to be a tough matchup for Odell Beckham, but he's already shown he can get open. Can Baker get him the football? That has to happen starting this week. I'm gambling, but it may be the last time that I do it here with the Browns. For Buffalo, it's really only John Brown, right? I mean, he's really only the weekly, one of the only weekly options in Buffalo. You could say that Cole Beasley deserves to be on the list, but realistically, yeah, he's got touchdowns in 3 straight games. However, he hasn't had more than 3 receptions in a game since week 3. So if he doesn't get that touchdown, he's really going to hurt your roster. He's very touchdown dependent. At some point, some of those touchdowns are going to start migrating back towards John Brown, who is the bigger play wide receiver in this offense. If Cleveland can come out and put up some points early, they're going to be forced to throw the ball. John Brown as a flex play, not somebody who I mind. He does have double-digit fantasy points 3 out of the last 4 games, and Cleveland allows 20.3 fantasy points per game. Not a bad matchup for John Brown as a flex play right here in Week 10. Lions and Bears up next, and man, do I love Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. The problem is Mitch Trubisky really sucks this year, and he's killing the upside of Allen Robinson. Now, right now, Detroit, they allow over 23 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So this is a good matchup for the Chicago Bears, but the inconsistencies from week to week are almost too much to bear at this point. I mean, you have an Allen Robinson who back in week 7 had 10 receptions. Last week, in a great matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles secondary, he had 1 reception. There is no consistency in this passing offense. Now, Allen Robinson could still be used as a flex play, maybe in deeper leagues if you're really hurting with bye weeks, because this is a home game for the Chicago Bears, where right now, on average, he's getting right around 13.5 fantasy points per game while playing at home. Not a horrible play. Love the upside of Allen Robinson. Please, Mitch Trubisky, remember how to play quarterback, though, just for 1 week. Taylor Gabriel's probably next in line there. But if we're struggling starting Allen Robinson, Taylor Gabriel isn't really an option either. This is a tough matchup for the Lions, though. I mean, right now, Chicago allows 15.2 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is 3rd best in the NFL. Now, Galladay, he has 100 yards 3 out of the last 4 games, and Marvin Jones has really started to turn it on as of late. He has 28 targets over the last 3 games. There's kind of a lack of a running game in Detroit, right? Nobody really there to be a workhorse running back. They haven't signed anybody that's really going to come in and demand carries. So they're going to rely on throwing the ball. And Matthew Stafford quietly having a great season right now. I would put both Marvin Jones and Kenny Galladay in my lineup this week if I was looking for wide receivers. Giants and Jets up next. And it sounds like we may be without Sterling Shepard here once again in Week 10. He'd cleared concussion protocol. It sounded like he was coming back this week. And then without playing a game of football, went back into concussion protocol. Not a good sign at this point. I hope they just rest the guy and let him get back to full health. But now we also have Evan Ingram, who's having an MRI done on his foot. There's a chance that he could be done for the year. I mean, that to me screams a whole lot of Saquon Barkley and Golden Tate. And right now, the Jets are allowing on average over 26 fantasy points per game, which is 8th most in the NFL. Golden Tate should be a pretty safe play here in Week 10. He's had 6 receptions in 4 straight games, and in the last 4 games, 3 of them have been double-digit fantasy production. Like I said, the floor should be safe. The ceiling could be somewhat limited in this offense. However, a very safe floor if you're looking at somebody here for bye weeks, injury fill-ins. As for the Jets, it's really hard to know what to think right now of the Jets. I mean, they lost to the Dolphins. I mean, not that the Dolphins are that bad, because they're playing better here as of late, but the Jets look absolutely horrible. Right now, Robbie Anderson has had 1 game with more than 4 receptions. 5 out of 8 games for Jamison Crowder have resulted in 40 yards or less receiving. Demaryius Thomas does not have 1 game in double-digit fantasy points this year. Even though the Giants allowed 28 fantasy points per game, which is 4th most in the NFL, I'm really preferring to avoid all of these guys at this point because I just don't know what to expect. If I really needed somebody in my lineup from this group, it would be Jamison Crowder. The problem with him is inconsistencies. He may go out there and see 10 targets in a week, the next week come out and get 2. They're not dedicated to one guy in this offense, and it makes it really hard to trust any of them on a weekly basis, especially here once again in Week 10. Chiefs and Titans up now, and it sounds like there's a good chance that Patrick Mahomes returns here in Week 10. But it doesn't really matter, right? If it's him or Matt Moore, you're still going to start Tyreek Hill at this point. The guy is matchup proof. He's quarterback proof. Doesn't really matter. Basically, all you have to do is chuck it as far as you can, and he'll find a way to chase it down. You're going to start Tyreek Hill regardless. But Sammy Watkins also has some sneaky flex play upside here this week. Going up against the Titans, middle of the pack pass defense, right now giving up on average just over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Sammy Watkins has seen 18 targets over the last 2 weeks. If that type of volume can stay consistent, he'll kind of have a little bit more of a safer floor on a week-to-week basis. If you're hurting with bye weeks or injuries, Sammy Watkins is not a bad option here for week 10. For the Titans, I really want to start Corey Davis and A.J. Brown all the time. I mean, the talent is absolutely crazy with these guys, but they're just so inconsistent from week to week. Kansas City, they only allow 18.3 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is 7th best in the NFL. In my opinion, I don't want to risk it with either one of these guys. If you're in a deeper league, maybe 12 teams or larger, and you need a flex play, I think A.J. Brown may be somewhat safer at this point just because it seems like the touchdown upside goes towards A.J. Brown, but Corey Davis is an elite talent that just can't seem to break out in Tennessee. At some point, big games are coming. I would prefer to have them on the bench this week, but if you have no better options, go with the upside of Corey Davis and A.J. Brown. Arizona Tampa Bay up next, and I think our days of old reliable Larry Fitzgerald may be over. He's just not consistent enough or involved enough in this offense to be a starting wide receiver here for fantasy football anymore. Christian Kirk, though, still a wide receiver I'm interested in for the Arizona Cardinals. He's seen 8+ targets in 4 out of the 6 games that he's played so far this year, and he has a great matchup. Tampa Bay, on average, gives up over 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, the most in the NFL. Plus, sounds like David Johnson is going to be back, and a backfield of David Johnson and Kenyon Drake could really draw defenders into the box, not so much just to shut down a running game, but that short passing game that those two running backs absolutely thrive on. That could really help out the likes of Christian Kirk on the outside. Another name to pay attention to, not worth a start yet, is Andy Isabella. Had a long touchdown last week. And don't forget, this is the guy who they traded Josh Rosen for in the 2nd round of last year's NFL draft. They really like this guy, and they're going to start finding a way to get him involved more and more as the season progresses. Andy Isabella is a name to be on your radar in larger leagues. Now, for Tampa Bay, it's really simple, right? If you have Chris Godwin or Mike Evans, you're starting both of them. Yes, they're each going to have their fair share of Patrick Peterson in this game, but the Arizona Cardinals give up over 24 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and both of these guys can single-handedly win you your fantasy matchup by themselves. You don't want that on your bench. Both Evans and Godwin remain a must-start here on a weekly basis. Falcons and Saints up next, and could we see a possible shootout in this game this week? Now, we already know that you're starting Julio Jones and Michael Thomas, and both of these teams allow over 25 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They're both obvious must-starts once again. But what about Calvin Ridley? He's also an option for me here this week. With Marshawn Lattimore more than likely lined up with Julio Jones and Matt Ryan back under center, we could see more targets going the way of Calvin Ridley this week. We already know that the New Orleans run defense is one of the tops in the league. If Atlanta can't get anything going on the ground, it's going to lead to more passing. Insert Calvin Ridley once again. I like the matchup for him, and this could be one of those bounce-back weeks for Calvin Ridley. There's a great chance for him to have a solid game here in Week 10. On the New Orleans side of things, I mean, there's really just, Ted Ginn. He hasn't had more than 2 receptions in a game since Week 4. Sounds like Alvin Kamara has a good chance of coming back. If that's the case, expect a heavy dose of Kamara and Michael Thomas, and not so much of anyone else. Michael Thomas is going to be the only wide receiver that I start here for the New Orleans Saints. Dolphins and Colts up next, and please don't make me do it. Talk me out of it, please. I mean, I just gave him the hashtag of never Bigfoot like a week or 2 ago. But now Preston Williams, he's done for the year. And it's the Dolphins. They're going to be trailing the majority of every game that they play in. There's no resemblance of a running game with Kalen Ballage, who thinks it's cool to duck on screen passes. Albert Wilson hasn't been involved here. Indianapolis allows 21.3 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Devontae Parker has touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games. I mean, he's going to remain fantasy Bigfoot, never Bigfoot for me, and I'm really not trying to hype him up as somebody who you need to start this week. But if you're suffering with bye weeks or injuries, I don't hate Devontae Parker again. And man, I hate to say that because the guy is literally Amari Cooper with the Oakland Raiders. He's sucking us back in, people. He's sucking us in, and he's going to blow at some point. And you don't want it to happen when it's in your lineup, but things are just lining up for him to have a solid floor. At least the volume should be there with no Preston Williams. For the Colts, we have no Paris Campbell. We have no T.Y. Hilton. So you really only have Zach Pascal. And this is a great matchup for him, right? Going against the Dolphins, who allow over 27 fantasy points per game, 7th most in the NFL. He should see a lot of targets and should be a solid flex play with wide receiver 2 upside. I like Zach Pascal this week as the number 1 wide receiver here for the Indianapolis Colts in Week 10. Rams and Steelers up now, and boy, do the Rams need to start things off quick in this game. They really need to gain some momentum here, second half of the season, if they want to make a run at the playoffs. There will be without Brandon Cooks here, and going up against a Pittsburgh defense which allows over 23 fantasy points per game. We already know that Cooper Kupp is going to be a must start. He's had double-digit points in 5 out of 8 games, 5 touchdowns through 8 games. He's definitely going to be somebody who's in your lineup. But Robert Woods, somebody else who's going to get a slight bump in volume with Brandon Cooks out. The touchdowns really may not be there, but the increased volume could really do him good and make him at least a solid flex play at worst with that wide receiver 2 upside on a weekly basis as long as Brandon Cooks is out. Josh Reynolds, somebody maybe if you're in a deeper league, has seen some, success in this offense before when wide receivers have missed. He does have some red zone upside. Not so much of a guy who's going to get a huge number of volume or targets, but he's somebody if you're in a deeper league and you have no better choices, somebody who I wouldn't mind rostering and starting if I had to in those deeper leagues. But for the Pittsburgh Steelers, I hate to say it, I'm not on the Juju train this week. More than likely, he's going to draw Jalen Ramsey. And he's been absolutely big play dependent, has Juju here, the past few weeks, ever since Big Ben went out. Only 75% of the targets he's received so far this year have actually been catchable. He only has one 100-yard game all year, and that was against the Miami Dolphins. It's just not a matchup that I love for Juju this week. Now, Deontay Johnson as a flex play in deeper leagues, I kind of like the upside, right? We know Jalen Ramsey's going to spend his time over there on Juju. There's a chance that James Conner is out. We know Benny Snell is out. Maybe they kind of limit the running game a little bit and have to rely more on the passing game. Deontay Johnson is somebody who has that big play upside. They're going to have to throw the ball more. He's a risky play. He's not a safe play by any means. More of those, deeper leagues, 14, 16 team leagues. That's why I start looking at Deontay Johnson as a possible flex play here in Week 10. Panthers and Packers up now, and it seems like Devontae Adams is back to full health. I mean, he had 11 targets last week, but they were all short underneath routes. They weren't pushing him down the field, and I have to believe they did that because they didn't want to re-aggravate any injury in his first game back. As they progress here through the second half of the season, I expect them to push him more and more each game, starting this week in Week 10 against the Panthers, who give up on average just over 23 fantasy points per game. If he's healthy, he's back in your lineup. But outside of Devontae Adams, a little bit too risky for my taste. MVS has basically disappeared at this point. He has 6 receptions over his last 5 games combined. Geronimo Allison has only gone over 50 yards receiving once all year. And those of you out there who are screaming that Allen Lazard is the next best option hasn't gone over 40 yards in the last 3 weeks. None of these guys give me that warm fuzzy on the inside. With the running game of Jamal Williams and Aaron Jones, now Devontae Adams back, I'm avoiding all the other wide receivers for the Green Bay Packers. For the Panthers, though, DJ Moore is somebody who I'm still very interested in. He's had 29 targets over the last 3 weeks. He just had his first 100-yard game of the year also this past week. Samuel kind of continues to be a little bit more touchdown dependent in this offense, but he has had touchdowns, 3 of them in the past 3 games. They're going to have to throw the ball here in Carolina. They rely on Christian McCaffrey for everything, but DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel kind of have that sneaky flex play upside on a weekly basis. Neither one of them are home run picks here in Week 10, but solid flex plays nonetheless when you're dealing with bye weeks and injuries. Vikings and Cowboys up next, and it sounds like we're going to be without Adam Thielen once again. Now, he left that game early last week after re-aggravating a hamstring injury, and Stephon Diggs went on to absolutely blow in that game. 1 reception for 4 yards. Now he gets a matchup with the Dallas Cowboys, who only give up 16.4 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is 3rd best in the NFL. But Stephon Diggs likes the big stage, and Kirk Cousins has been playing really well. He has 14 touchdowns to only 1 interception since week 3. Diggs thrived without Adam Thielen here in the past, and we expect him to start that up once again here this week. Who picks up some of that slack left behind by Adam Thielen? Olabisi Johnson probably is the guy, but am I really, rushing to throw him into my lineup? Not really. Maybe if you're in a super deep 14, 16 team league, he is somebody who could see a slight bump in volume and give you some possible production, but in normal 10 or 12 man leagues, he's not a name that I'm actively targeting here this week. For the Cowboys, I'm still going to roll with Cooper and Gallup, though. Minnesota gives up on average over 23 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Cooper is banged up, though, so pay attention to practice reports. It does sound like he is going to play. I mean, he's had double-digit fantasy points in all but 2 games. Minnesota right now has allowed 13 wide receivers to hit at least 11.5 fantasy points in a game. Both of these guys are going to be involved in the game plan. Michael Gallup has shown that big play potential also alongside of Amari Cooper, and both of these guys deserve, a start here in week 10. Michael Gallup, more of a flex play, in those 10, 12, 14 team leagues at best, really. His ceiling is somewhat capped just because of the production of Amari Cooper at this point. However, if anything happens to Amari Cooper, an immediate bump to Michael Gallup. Don't forget Zeke Elliott in the backfield. He's really starting to turn it on, here as of the last few weeks, and that's drawing defenders into the box, leaving more one-on-one coverage on the outside. Both of these guys, though, Cooper and Gallup, starting them here in week 10. Seattle and San Francisco, a NFC West divisional game here that should be pretty fun to watch on Monday Night Football, but I really don't want to get too cute here. The 49ers only allow 17.9 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is 5th best in the NFL. Richard Sherman of the 49ers has himself a little bit of a revenge game. He's going to be fired up to go against his former team. Josh Gordon, he could be added into the mix. How many targets does he possibly see here this week? Do those targets take away from the upside of DK Metcalf? There are a lot of questions and a lot of things going on here this week in this game. Now, DK Metcalf, I'm still going to have him as a flex play only. In the past couple of weeks, I've really liked it, and I've had him as a surefire start, and he's played just great. However, in this matchup with some, these intangibles of Josh Gordon and a tough defense on the road, Monday Night Football, flex play at best for DK Metcalf, but we're still going to start Tyler Lockett. The way they move him around the field and the majority of the time in the slot really gives him that opportunity to break a big play, and he's highly, highly involved in that offense. For San Francisco, though, it's really just Emmanuel Sanders. The Seahawks give up on average right around 23 fantasy points per game, but Sanders, the way he moves around, also Jimmy G really looks for him, and he looks, rejuvenated in this offense. He is a big-time playmaker in this offense. Now, the San Francisco 49ers, they do get back a couple offensive linemen, and it sounds like Kyle Juszczyk also this week. If that's the case, they could heavily rely on the running game, which they did to start the entire part of the season. If that's the case, they're going to have to collapse the defense, bring more defenders into the box, and Emmanuel Sanders could just eat over the top. Love him this week. Both those guys, Emmanuel Sanders, Tyler Lockett, going to be starts. DK Metcalf, more of a flex play only here in week 10. All right, those are my wide receiver starts and sits here week 10 fantasy football. Let me know what you think down below. Once again, remember, don't get too caught up in the start or sit column. Listen to the information for those players to help you make those decisions this week for your team. Nobody knows all the intangibles that go into your roster, your opponent. Who do you have on bye? What's your record? What's your stand? I mean, there's so many things that go into it. Nobody can sit here on any YouTube channel and without a shadow of a doubt give you the solid right answer all the time. They just don't have all the information. And that's why over here, we're just trying to supply you the information and let you make those decisions for your teams on Sundays. And it's a lot of fun. People are really enjoying it, having a lot of fun with fantasy football here this year. Hopefully you are too. We greatly appreciate the support. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you later.